Hey everyone, welcome to my studio. My name is Elizabeth Bostic, and I am so excited to be painting a loose watercolor floral with you today. The brush that I'm using today is the number 6 round brush, and the paper that I have for today is the Arches or Arche paper 140-pound cold pressed. For the first color, I dip my paintbrush in the water and then blot the water on a paper towel and then pick up as much paint as I can as the brush will hold so that the tip is nice and saturated with the paint. I'm using a pretty red, it's called Madder Rose, but you can use any red or pink or purple that you want your rose color to be, maybe even an orange. For the first few strokes on the paper, I'm doing little tiny squiggles and keeping the paint nice and thick and rich. So I'm going back into the paint to make sure that there's a lot of pigment, a lot of paint on my brush. And I'm starting with those inner tight little petals with a lot of pigment, a lot of paint on the brush. For the next step, I'm going to be rinsing out some of the paint from the brush and putting my wet brush directly onto the paper at an angle so that the petals will get wider and wider. The brush that I'm using, the number 6 brush, is a little bit thin for this, but it's one that I feel comfortable using on such a small in such a small area with such a small painting. But if you have a larger brush that you're comfortable using, it is much easier to get those thicker petals. So again, after doing the initial smaller interior petals, you are rinsing a little bit of the paint off of your brush and then touching that wet brush to the already painted thinner lines of the interior petals, and then bringing that petal out to make a thicker petal. And then as you go, you're adding more and more water to your brush, so you're rinsing out more of the paint so it's more water and less paint that is on your brush. And when you touch it to the petals that are already down that have more paint, that paint spreads into the lighter wash. It spreads into the new petals that you're painting, and it's giving them some more of that pink or red color. So as you extend your petals out, as you add more and more petals, you want them to be fatter and fatter, wider and wider. And if you lose so much of the paint on your brush that it's just clear watercolor, you can then go in and add some more paint to your watercolor. But before you do that, you want to make a light wash so that the paint that you're adding isn't that intense, rich paint. It's a very watered down wash of the color. To make the wash, I add about 4 brushfuls of water and then the Madder Rose that I'm using to paint the rose with. A couple more brushfuls of water, mix it up well, and then test that color onto my little scrap paper just to make sure that I like the strength of the color, that I like that value, and then add it right into the rose. Looking at the rose, I thought it didn't quite look balanced enough, so I'm adding one more petal, and it kind of gives it more of a circular form, but with the petals creating the organic rose shape. And that feels more balanced to me. Next, I'm going to mix the green that I will start with for the background. You can use any green that you would like. The green that I used from this set is called just green, and it's the PG8 that I then mixed with a little bit of the cadmium deep yellow and the sepia. This created a more muted green that had matched the look that I was going for. For the design, I referenced my practice rose, and I really liked the way the greenery swooped around. On the top, it swooped up to the left, and on the bottom, it also swooped down into the left. So it gave the background a bit of movement and a bit of a flow, and I really liked that design. So I'm going to try to match what I had done for my practice painting. And for the very first leaf, I start by dipping my dried off paintbrush into the mix, into the wash that I created of that almost like an olive green. It's like a warm muted green. And I touch the tip of it right to where the two petals meet, right up against the color, and very carefully draw it so that I'm not overlapping the petals. And then I add just a dot of the, I believe, the ultramarine blue right where those two petals meet. And that color is creating that wet on wet blending effect that I just love. And then on the second leaf, I created it the same way. Started where two of the petals meet together. I added just a dot of the same red that I made the rose with, the madder rose color. And I put just a dot of that where the two petals meet so that it would bleed wet on wet into the leaf. For the next set of leaves, I started this time the stem of the leaves right where the two petals came together and made a flowy, curvy line where I then attached 3 leaf shapes. The rose leaves have the two that are together, and then the one alone at the top. So I thought that was a fun leaf design to add in there. This time, for a little bit of extra pop for the leaves, a little bit of extra color for that wet on wet beautiful thing that watercolor does, I added just a little bit of that green paint right from the palette. I popped it right in there, and I am very happy with the way that this is bleeding into and adding a little more interest to that color. So for the next swoop of leaves, I again started with the stem and then added a leaf shape onto it, and I very carefully paint along the edge of the petal. And at this point, the petals are pretty dry, especially on the top now. So that's important if you don't want the color of the leaves to blend in with the color of the petals, or the color of the petals blending in with the color of the leaves. You'll want to make sure that the petals are completely dry before you start painting the leaves right next to it. Otherwise, those two colors will intermingle, which I really do like that look as well. It just depends on what you want for your painting, on what kind of look you're going for. So this time I was very cognizant of adding that second color in right away while the leaves were still very wet, so that they would create that wet on wet blending without creating a bloom or like a tidal water line where you can see that edge more clearly. So I put that little bit of color. Again, I just used that same red that I'm using for the rose, just in between those two petals, right where the leaf meets, right where it touches the rose. For The next bit of greenery, I'm going ahead and mixing some of that same green with the ultramarine blue so that I will have it ready for when I want to add a little bit of a pop of a different color to the green leaves that I will be making next. This way there'll be less of a stark contrast, but still enough contrast that it will be noticeable and you'll be able to see a bit more blue in the green. For the next bit of greenery, I have it going from the left-hand side of the paper, swooping up gradually till it hits the line of the petal, and I'm just careful to stop right on that border between the petal and the paper so that the greenery goes right up to the very edge of the petal. And then I'm creating my little leaves. I'm doing this just to break up the size and type of leaves that I'm using to add a little more interest into the painting. I love looking at the paintings of loose florals where they use all kinds of greenery and it looks like a little bouquet on paper. So I'm really trying to create that here. And while the little leaf shapes are still wet, I'm putting in some of that blue, ultramarine blue and green mixture so that it is flowing nicely and it's not too much of a contrast, but it adds some of the blue-green to add more interest to the leaves. So for the next detail, my inspiration was a painting that I had seen where it looked like little tiny pink flowers on some kind of a branch. So I used the watered down green that I used for the leaves. And then I put a few of the leaves onto the branch, which you want to make sure to start with a thicker line right where it's attached to the rose. And then as you go up the branches, you'll use just the very tip of your brush and make them go thinner as they move away from the rose. And then the little leaves that I'm attaching to it, they're very tiny. They're the smallest leaves yet. And to paint them, I'm using just the very tip of the paintbrush and holding it almost straight up and down. For the flowers that will be attached to the branch, I'm using the same red as the rose and painting in just a few petals to give you the feeling of a flower, but not so many details where you lose that looseness of the painting. And as I am touching the flowers right onto the still wet branches and leaves, some of that pink color is then flowing into that muted green color and giving it that beautiful wet on wet blending effect. Here you can see that I'm using my paintbrush kind of like a sponge to soak up a little bit of extra paint. And to do that, you'll just wipe your paintbrush down on your paper towel or cloth and then go back in and touch the area you want to soak back up, and it works almost like a sponge. For the next piece of this painting, we are mixing a little bit of burnt sienna, which is a very warm, almost reddish golden brown. So you don't have to use burnt sienna, you could use any warm brown that you may have. And I mixed it in with just a little bit of green and then watered it down. I'm starting again right from the petal, and I'm creating short, curvy lines, each one getting smaller than the last. So the thickest of the lines is right where the lines meet the edge of the petal. And then similarly to a tree branch, they are getting thinner and smaller as you go from the rose towards the edge of the paper. To add a little bit of interest or color pop to it, I dip my brush into the same red that I used for the rose, or pink, and I'm adding just a little bits of that pink to it. With this next element to the painting, I'm using that same wash or watered down warm brown and making just little tiny circles, little dots with the tip of the brush. When I am happy with the shape of them, I take my paper towel and I blot them so that the shapes remain and a hint of color remains, but they are now very, very muted. And then as they are still damp, I go in with the pink and I add just little tiny dots, a dot to each one. For the stems for these flowers, I use the same green that I had used for the leaves of the rose. While the stems are still wet, I dab in just a little bit of that mix of the green and the ultramarine blue. And I'm really liking the way that that is mixing together on the paper. And then I'm adding just a little bit of a hint of that green stem up through the top of these tiny flowers. For this next leaf shape, the color that I'm using is a mix between the ultramarine blue and the green that I'm using. It's mostly blue with a little bit of that green and then watered down. The shapes of these leaves are almost round, a bit of an oval shape. And then I'm attaching them to a very thin stem. I believe this is the thinnest stem that I have used so far. And I'm also layering these leaves and the stem over completely dried leaves of the rose. So you want to make sure that anything you are layering on top of is completely dry so that the two colors do not blend into each other. This way, if you have a very watered down, very transparent layer on top of what you've already painted, the bottom layer, the first leaves that you've painted, will be able to show through. I really love layering and playing with the transparent quality of watercolor. Even the more semi-transparent or semi-opaque colors, you're able to layer with them as long as you use the right amount of water to really thin it out. As you can see here, the leaf that I have just painted is blending into the leaf next to it because the leaf next to it was still wet, a little bit wetter than I had thought it was, but the leaf that I'm painting now is going nicely on top of the leaf next to it, as that one was dry enough to paint on top of and not have them blend into it. The petals are completely dry now, as are the leaves that I am painting over right now, so you can see it's just giving you that nice transparent look, and the colors are not bleeding into each other. For this next leaf, I'm using again a combination of the ultramarine blue and the green that I have. It is a darker wash, and I am soaking up a little bit of it with my brush. It soaks up kind of like a sponge, and then adding in just a little bit of that red that we used for the rose to give it a little more interest to the color. For this next flower, I was inspired by kind of the, I don't want to say brain, that's not maybe beautiful to some people, but almost a brain texture of this locia where it has all those intricate folds and that really cool texture, really cool detail. So I used that same watered down golden warm brown and making sure everything underneath it that was going to be underneath it was completely dry. You can use your hair dryer, or if you have one of those handy mini dryers. I used the very tip of my brush and made very thin lines and created kind of a celosia type flower effect. And then with just the golden watered down warm brown, and then added little bits of that pinky red wash to it so that it created this warm pinky golden flower effect. For this next set of leaves, you want to make sure, again, whatever you're painting on top of is completely dry. Maybe get a hair dryer, wait for a while, and then just touch it to make sure that it is bone dry, completely dry. I again am using the watered down combination of mostly ultramarine blue with a little bit of the green, and it is very, very watered down. So it is just a very, very light wash, a light glazing on top. And then the next little flower or little plant that I'm adding start out as these little tiny blue circles. Again, I'm going over paint that is completely bone dry, completely dry, so that this blue is not spreading into that corally pink or the green leaf underneath it. So just like as before when I made those little round circular shapes, I am again making those little round circular shapes, but this time with the mix of the blue-green. I am using that same watered down blue-green and adding just a little bit of more water to it, making sure again everything that I'm painting on top of is extremely dry, and I'm making a longer, thinner, larger leaf shape and making it in that very pale, very watered down, soft blue-green. And then just a touch of the pink right at the base where it attaches to the rose in between the two petals, which creates a light violet. To keep the painting, the composition looking balanced, I thought it needed a little bit of that blue-green in the bottom right-hand corner as well, so I went ahead and added some more of those little blue circles. Then towards the top, because the coral looking plant was dried already and so was the leaf, I went ahead and added in kind of like a densely branching sedum or something with a seed pod I was thinking of, and added those in, making sure to have the branches getting smaller towards the top and thicker towards the bottom, and adding just a little bit of more intense color here and there, just dropping it in. It was still very wet, so it bled in nicely together. It had that nice wet on wet blending. Once those little tiny blue circular flowers or seed pods maybe at the bottom right hand corner are dry, I'm going in and placing just a tiny little dot towards the top of each of them with that warm, very diluted brown color, and then adding in for their stem that same color, very diluted, starting right from the edge of the petal of the rose and going up into the little flowers or seed pods, however you want to think of them. and then adding just a little hint of it towards the very bottom of the paper. And dabbing in just a little bit extra color towards the very base and a little bit towards the top of the brown. Then I am taking that same color and adding a similar width of a stem to the top right-hand corner, and then deciding where else I want to put them to keep the flow, to keep that feeling of the painting. And I decide to put another one right at the top of the rose, on top of the leaf there that is, again, it's completely dry. For the flowers to go along with this stem, I decide on just teeny tiny little dots of color. So I use the same color, which is that watered down, like warm brown, and I'm just very lightly pressing the very teeny tiny tip of the paintbrush against the paper and leaving almost just like a texture, just like a hint of a flower behind. I was thinking maybe dried seed pods or maybe a dried sedum, and just leaving a hint of that. After the painting has completely dried, I am removing the tape. It's coming off very well, and I am thrilled with this painting. It was so much fun to do. Thank you so much for joining me painting today. I hope that you get the chance to sit down with your paints and create something. Maybe play with the transparencies or the loose watercolor or the wet on wet mixing. I had so much fun doing it myself that I created a second one done in a very similar way using the same techniques. So now I have a sister painting and I'm going to be hanging them up together at my house. I'm pretty pleased with that. I hope that you enjoyed watching this painting video, that you're able to try out some of the techniques that we've done today, and I'll see you next time.